Chapter 10. Break. We could steal something bigger, but we would need to make it seem like something else. Otherwise, the Amaya would hunt us down. But is that even possible? We would need Last Shadow's caverns to store it and repair it, but even then, won't that be large enough? Circa 7 days, 22 hours, since the assassination of rebel leadership. Deities! Uchantu opened her eyes, still concentrating on her measured breathing, and followed Luhuta's gesture out the cockpit viewport. Up ahead, still about 2 minutes off, an Imaya train had rounded a bend in the craggy hills as it sped poleward. Flexing her hands, Uchantu took the radio. All right, teams, remember, we're taking only what we need, nothing else. We need to be in and out before the next checkpoint, and the Amaya isn't likely to send Lightforged or a search team looking for a water car and some ration crates if they think that's all we're after. If they notice missing gem braces, dark side plants, and rare metals, they'll think we're building up for an attack, and they might have a clue where to start looking. We'll need to balance the amounts we steal to cover up our intentions. They'd be taking some medical supplies and fuel as well, but those should hopefully go unnoticed as well in the quantities they sought. As the train sped closer, Uchantu frowned, wishing they had more ships so they could take more than 3 transports of supplies. More ships would not only mean more water and rations, but more variety of other resources they could take. The speeder bikes they had waiting concealed near the tracks could each take only a crate, and they were mostly along for support and to pick up anyone that fell off the train during the raid. If they brought more ships, though, then they would have to steal more fuel or power cores. The palladium cores the Amaya ships ran on were extremely efficient, but the metal was rare, and even in small quantities, it would be missed. There was also the issue of geaurorals needed to power the magnetic field that shielded the pilots and passengers from the resulting radiation. Uchantu peered at the train for a bit longer as they closed in. Only 84 more seconds. Then looked back to the cabin. Her team stood ready, gripping hooks instead of strapped to their seats. Ready with the containers? Kakengo nodded. Ready, squad leader. Uchantu nodded back, taking a deep breath. She raised the radio again. Edendo, Muzuri, you ready? Ready. Uchantu looked to her pilot. Luhuta is in charge in the air. On the ground, team leaders are myself, Arena, and Yaren. Keep comms to a minimum. Radio only when you've finished or if you need help. Affirmative. Uchantu unbuckled herself and rose to join her team. Good luck out there, Luhuta called. I'll be ready. Uchantu grabbed the hook closest to the door, meeting the eyes of each of her companions. You can do this. The plan was simple enough. Each team would drop on top of a different section of the train. Arena's people would drop to the water car near the end, Yaren's team would retrieve the rations and darkside plants, and Uchantu's team would get the rare metals, fuel cells, and gem braces. Coming over the train now, Luhuta announced. A moment later, the cabin's door hissed, then slid open, buffeting the inside with a warm wind. Hand tight around her hook, Uchantu leaned toward the door and peered down at the train speeding along below them. It was still a bit too far and moving too fast for them to drop. Remember, she yelled to her team, don't kill the guards if you don't have to. We don't want to give the Amaya any more reason to hunt us down than necessary. They nodded, expressions grim or hidden by masks. Uchantu looked back out the door just as Luhuta called, Better jump soon! She was right. The car was barely 2 meters below the door, and Luhuta had the ship moving fast enough to keep pace with it. I hate this part. Uchantu sucked in a deep breath, then chopped her hand toward the door. Drop! She held tight to the hook as Tshala and Axeli rushed past her and leapt down onto the train, landing with thuds barely audible over the wind. Kakengo and Mabnel moved up to the opening with one of the large refuse containers, then heaved it out the door. Uchantu winced even as her teammates caught it down below. The containers weren't too heavy, they were mostly just unwieldy, but doing anything other than sitting or standing on something flying through the air made her nervous. They repeated the maneuver 4 more times, then jumped down after the last crate. Uchantu swallowed, then forced herself out the transport. She landed in a crouch on the smooth metal roof of the car, and looked up just in time to see all 3 transports rising back into the air. To either side of the tracks, the speeders kept pace with the train. The desert heat settled over her immediately, despite the wind created by the train. Uchanto took a deep breath, then got behind one of the crates and started pushing toward where the cars met. They had to do this fast. They weren't just racing against the Amaya, but the transport's fuel cells. They burned a lot to make sure they kept up with the trains. Despite a few close calls slipping on the smooth metal, Uchanto and her team got their crates to the end of the car. They would push down the crates just like they had from the ship to get them inside the cars and switch them out. But Uchanto needed to go down first, this time. She climbed down the ladder with care, keeping one hand gripping a rung when she stepped onto the narrow platform before the door. The heat was worse down here. The light, too. The Amai used a near-white metal for the outside of their train cars to reflect the light and keep things cool within. Though the Amaya had both incredible mundane and geauroral technology, they loved to use geaurorals for as much as they could, including locks, and they kept these on the outside of the cars for easy replenishment of aurora light. Taking out a pair of pliers and a screwdriver, Uchanto unfastened and removed the housing, then studied the wireframe beneath for a moment. After following the different metals between the glowing biogems, she blinked. She glanced up around the door and tensed at the little nozzles around the frame that pointed toward her. This is set to spit fire if anything touches the wires. Uchanto took a deep breath and holstered her tools, frowning, then brightened her gem crest. She first created a hard light shield between herself and the door that would funnel any flames off to the side, then made an approximation of pliers out of hard light and set to work. Flames blossomed between the door and the shield the second her construct touched the wires, and Uchanto jumped, nearly losing concentration. Only years of training under Estingai and Aitiparit let her keep her focus as flames billowed before her. She soon began to sweat. Hard light conducted energy, and it was hard to see the wires behind the flames. But after a few pauses to memorize the layout, she was able to feel her way through the wireframe and bend back the correct wires to disable the device without shutting it down. Without all of the gems connected, the flames abated, and the gray node strengthened lock and dark light force field behind it failed. Uchanto slid open the door, then put her foot through the opening and brightened her gem crest. She created a small, hard light bar up where her team could see it and spun it in the air. A moment later, Kakengo poked his head over and smiled, then started down the ladder. Uchanto left him and the others to get the crates while she slipped into the car to find the containers they would be switching out. She found them with little issue, locating the correct containers by a small marking scratched onto the end of the large Atonga characters labeling the contents and handling instructions, and worked with the others to switch them out with what they'd brought. They were halfway done when a loud hiss sounded from the other end of the car. Uchanto looked up just in time to see 2 Amaya guards in red and white lightly armored uniforms step into the car, rifles leveled. "Down!" Uchanto barked. She plugged her ears and brightened her gem crest. Even as the Amaya guards fired, a wall of hard light appeared before Uchanto. She winced as the hard light cracked, shielding them from the rounds, but brightened her gem crest even more, strengthening the light as she pushed it toward the guards. The Amaya soldiers wore helmets, but nothing over their faces, so Uchanto saw their eyes widen as the wall of golden light advanced. They barely had time to turn before it slammed into them, knocking them back into the now closed car door. Grinning, Uchanto condensed the hard light, forming a shell over the 2 dazed guards. "Mavnel, now!" Mavnel's Samyadi Grey Nodes granted him prodigious strength rather than the enhanced speed and agility of Natari Grey Nodes, but they still got him to the guards in 2 seconds. He smacked each of them in the head for good measure, knocking them out before tying them up and shoving them into a corner. As Mavnel and the others went back to moving the crates, Uchanto stood over the guards, just to the side of the doors, and peered out the door's small, tinted window, counting the seconds. Her team had the smallest load, so they should be done first. Once they had everything loaded onto the transport, she would go check on the others. No more guards had appeared on the platform outside her door, so she glanced back to her team. They were almost done switching the containers. Uchanto allowed herself a smile. This could... "Uchanto!" Naruna's voice crackled over the radio in her helmet. "I think I need some help back here with the water car. We've secured it, but getting it out of here isn't going to be as easy as we thought." Uchanto frowned, then looked back to her team. They paused their work, tense, attention on her. I'm going to help Naruna, she said, opening the door. Get everything onto the transport and go. I'll catch a ride on one of the other ships or radio Luhuta if I need anything. They nodded as the doors hissed open. Uchantu looked to the guards, then thought of something. Move a few more crates to box them in once you're done, she said, turning toward the outer platform. Hopefully that will cause a little confusion for the Amaya. Uchantu didn't wait for an affirmative as she stepped out onto the platform and started climbing the ladder to the roof. Her people may not be trained soldiers, but they knew how to work under pressure, and confusing the Amaya was something they'd all grown very good at in the past few years. When she reached the top, Uchantu peeked over first, just to be safe. There were no guards on the roofs, but she could see a few shapes in dark clothing toward the end of the train. Taking a deep breath, Uchantu pulled herself up and scrambled over the roof on all fours. She tried as much as she could not to pound on the roof, but she feared slipping and flying off the train much more than alerting a few guards to her presence. When Uchantu got close enough to the figures to make out who they were, she frowned, letting out a sigh. Of course it's Arena. Uchantu continued past the woman and grabbed onto the ladder, putting herself between the two cars. Below her on the platforms, two of Arena's team stood to either side of the door, and another, Naruna, Uchantu guessed, crouched on the platform of the opposite car with another teammate holding her waist. Uchantu frowned, realizing something was off about the picture, then blinked. There's no door. Uchantu looked to Arena. What's going on? They're using the entire car to store the water, Arena shouted over the rushing wind. It's just one big tank, not pallets of water jugs like they've done before. Uchantu frowned. They'd known that was a possibility. Usually the Amaya had one of each, but... You checked the surrounding ones? Uchantu asked. Arena nodded, waving toward the other cars. All three of these are water tanks. No doors. Just control panels and ports to attach big hoses. We found a few of those in the car 2 back, but we don't have anything to drain it into. Uchantu bit her lip. And the refuse containers? Arena nodded back in the direction Uchantu had come. Okada's got them balancing on the platforms between the cars where we found the hoses. We already switched out the 3 that were for the medical supplies, though. Any ideas? Before Uchantu could think, a loud thud sounded from back the way she'd come. She whipped her head around just in time to see 2 of the containers Arena's team had brought down fall off the train and fly out over the rocky expanse beside the railway. Uchantu winced as it almost hit the speeder that kept pace with the train, but its rider, she couldn't tell if it was Bavlos or Indu at this distance, narrowly dodged the massive projectile and fell back alongside the train, gaining a bit of speed as they raced over the arid, rocky ground. Uchantu looked to Arena. Then, as one, they pulled themselves up onto the roof of the car and ran across it. When they reached the gap, Uchantu saw the open door of the next car and brightened her gem crest, leaping before she checked what was beneath her. She formed a slanted platform with the hard light and slid down it on her side, 1 foot out, with another plate of hard light beneath that into the open doorway. Her hard light foot shield took an Amaya guard in the head, knocking him to the floor. Keeping her gem crest bright, Uchantu rolled out of the way as she hit the ground, making way as Arena slid down behind her. She waited for the thud of her teammate hitting the ground, then whirled and took in the scene. Okada was pressed against the wall of the opposite car, desperately trying to hold back 3 Amaya guards, while more rushed at Uchantu and Arena from a section of benches farther down past some coiled hoses and other tools that hung on the walls. Help him! Uchantu barked, turning back toward the inside of the car and throwing up another wall of hard light. I've got these ones. Uchantu didn't wait to see if Arena followed her orders before stalking toward the incoming guards on the other side of her hard light wall. She counted 8 guards coming for her, and all of them carried rifles. That she should be able to take care of with little issue, but only if none of them were Auroramancers. Once she was less than a meter away, Uchantu reshaped the hard light to fit the hull down the middle of the car and shoved it toward the guards. It caught the first 2, but the others threw themselves out of the way, and Uchantu had to conjure another hard light wall between them to catch their fire, even as she slammed the first 2 against the back wall. Can't let them draw this out. They still needed to figure out what to do with the water. Gritting her teeth, Uchantu took a deep breath, then rushed the guards, gem crest bright. She strained with the effort of holding the hard light as it blocked their gunfire, but once she was inside the back half of the car, Uchantu broke up her wall and sent a piece directly for each of the guards. 2 hit and dazed the guards. The others blocked the hard light with their rifles. That was all Uchantu needed. forming a hardlight tonfa in each hand, ridged halves extending out like shields over her forearms. Uchantu rushed the closest guard. She used one to shove his rifle aside as he raised it and slammed the other into his neck where it met the shoulder. He dropped, even as his rifle fired a quick barrage toward one of his companions. Uchantu yanked the rifle from his limp grip and whipped it toward the next guard. The Omaya woman cried out as it hit her in the face, and Uchantu followed up by reforming her tonfas and jabbing the ends of both into the guard's chest. Uchantu winced even as she did so, but she knew it was effective, even with the woman's light armor. A rifle went off behind her, and Uchantu conjured a hardlight shield just in time to keep a round from ripping through her shoulder. As it was, the impact cracked the hardlight and sent her stumbling forward. She'd definitely have a bruise there later. Uchantu shot the shield straight backward, then whipped around, reassessing her surroundings. 4 guards were down, either unconscious or sprawled on the floor, and her shield slammed one against the wall. That left 3. One had dropped her rifle and drawn a knife, while the other held his rifle like a staff, and the third held her hands up in a fighting guard. The rifle was the most dangerous. Uchantu threw one of her tonfas at that one, then conjured twin blocks of hardlight as the man ducked. One slammed into his face, while the other swept his feet out from underneath him, whipping him backward. Other sounds of fighting reached her ears then, but Uchantu couldn't focus on that. Not yet. Dropping into a crouch, Uchantu spun and lashed out with a kick as the guard with the knife lunged. She avoided Uchantu's kick, but not the edged bar of hardlight Uchantu conjured and swung at her hip. It landed with a crack, and the woman crumbled. Uchantu was about to turn and face the last one when someone grabbed her by the collar and flung her into the wall. Uchantu hit and fell onto one of the benches with a groan. She didn't think anything was broken, but darkness, she hurt. Dull thuds sounded from behind, and Uchantu shook her head and flared her gem crest, conjuring a bar of hardlight to send into her assailant's middle. She heard the thud and the grunt, but when she turned around, Uchantu found a stocky woman in a light cover holding the hardlight at bay. Her posture made Uchantu certain the woman wore a snarl beneath her helmet. Why does it have to be a grey arm? Setting her jaw, Uchantu dismissed the hardlight. The woman stumbled forward, and Uchantu met her with a kick to the stomach. It did nothing. Perke. Uchantu's foot hurt, and the guardswoman snorted as she grabbed for Uchantu's ankle. Panic set in, and Uchantu shot 2 hardlight beads at the eye slits of the woman's helmet. She cried out, stumbling back as she swatted at them, and Uchantu scrambled away. The woman could have thrown her again or simply crushed Uchantu's ankle. Uchantu headed for the opposite side of the car, intending to keep as much distance between her and the grey arm as possible, when something hard slammed into her shoulder. She fell to the ground, wind knocked out of her. Desperate, she drew in ragged breaths, trying to get some air into her lungs. Thumps sounded from behind her, and Uchantu pushed herself over to find the Amaya woman looming over her. Twin thunderclaps split the air. The guard stumbled back. Uchantu cried out at the deafening noise, raising a hand to her ear to check for blood, then blinked as the Amaya woman fell to her knees, face still concealed by her helmet. Eyes wide, Uchantu turned around, pushing herself to her feet. Arena stood behind her, rifle leveled, barrel still smoking. She met Uchantu's gaze. Perka. It was the wrong thing to say, and Uchantu knew it. She would be the one that had to report this to Estingai. Arena's expression darkened. We weren't supposed to kill anyone if we could avoid it. We couldn't. That's one less Imaya Auroramancer we have to deal with. You're welcome. Let's get out of here. Taking a deep breath, Uchantu straightened and rushed out of the car with Arena past the fallen guards. I'm sorry, Uchantu said as they reached Okada, who was tying the guards to a ladder. There were only 2, not 3, she noticed. Thank you. I know we've all lost a lot of people to the Amaya, but we can't be the monsters they say we are. Arena rounded on her, expression tight. Do you have any ideas for the water car? We need that even more than the rations. Uchantu bit her lip. Arena was right. Getting the supplies back to base was what mattered. But we can't lose a ship or anyone on this team getting out of here. Not if she could prevent it. She looked down at the platform, then between the cars. Uchantu's eyes grew wide and she grinned, then activated her radio. Yaren, how's your team doing?
All good, Uchantu.
Had a close call with the guards, but we're all back on the transport. Nothing Adendo and I can't do as long as we're working together. Uchantu smiled at that. Great. Head back to base. Have Adendo radio Luhuta and tell her to do the same. What about you? I've got a ride. Got it. See you tonight, squad leader. Uchantu shut off her radio, then looked to Irena and Okaada. The Antari man looked between her and Irena. I take it that means you have a plan. Uchantu nodded. You two get your team back on the transport with one of those hoses, but tell Muzuri to stay in the air. Once everyone and everything is aboard, come to Naruna and I at the cars. Irena frowned, but nodded, and all three climbed back up to the roof of the cars. Uchantu waited for Irena to go first so the woman could talk to her squad, then followed her down and crouched next to Naruna. I have a plan, she shouted over the wind, but it's not going to be fun. Naruna turned her masked face to Uchantu, nearly hitting her with one of her antlers. Let's do it. Uchantu. Uchantu blinked at Luhuta's voice over the radio. Luhuta? What is it? You've got about 2 minutes before we get dangerously close to the next Amaya checkpoint. Whatever you're going to do it now. Uchantu gritted her teeth. She'd forgotten about that. Got it. You get out of here. A moment later, Irena thumped down on the platform beside her. What's the plan? Is everyone on the transport? Irena nodded. They're about to be. I told Muzuri to hang around for us. Uchantu took a deep breath, then looked between the two of them. Do you trust me? Naruna nodded immediately. Irena hesitated, but after a moment gave a curt nod. Uchantu looked to Naruna. Can you unhitch this? Naruna cocked her head. Yes, but... Do it, Uchantu ordered. She hopped over to the other platform, then helped Naruna and Irena over. Do you need any help? She asked as the Samyati woman crouched down, reaching between the cars. Naruna shook her head. Just hold me tight so I don't fall off. Uchantu looked to Irena, and they each took hold of the ladder with one hand and Naruna with the other, crouching on the platform. A few seconds passed, and Uchantu's stomach grew tight. She looked to Irena. You can break the cars once we're free, right? Irena nodded. I hope you know what you're doing. Uchantu took a deep breath. So do I. Naruna, Uchantu asked. How much? 6 seconds, she shouted. 4, 3, 2, break! Uchantu shouted, gripping the ladder with white knuckles. The cars shook as the coupling came undone and Naruna lurched forward. Uchantu yanked back on the woman's light cover, then conjured a hard light brace to push them back against the car for good measure. She looked to Irena to find the woman holding one hand out before her. Uchantu knew it wasn't necessary, but gestures like that helped even her direct her abilities. After 37 seconds, they came to a stop, the cars shaking as they hovered above the tracks. Before them, the train sped off poleward toward one of the Amaya's desert checkpoints. Ha! Uchantu cried, jumping to her feet. We did it! She grinned as she looked between Irena and Naruna. The Samyati woman wobbled her head, and Irena actually smiled for a moment before scowling and looking around. What do we... Irena cut off, shaking her head, then lowered her voice. What do we do now? I can get us off the tracks, but I hope you don't expect me to push these things all the way back to Wolf Den. Uchantu grinned, shaking her head. Before she could explain, though, Bavlos and Indu pulled up on either side of the tracks on their speeders. I'm hoping this was part of the plan, Indu said, taking off his helmet. Uchantu nodded and turned on her radio. Luhuta? Muzuri? Idendo? Yes, they answered after one another. I need you to drop the supplies and our teams off at a safe spot where they can either sit tight or start back toward Wolf Den. Then get back here as soon as possible. Instead of water jugs, we have 3 water cars. I can see that, Muzuri said over Luhuta's what? How do you plan on getting those back to base? Muzuri asked. Uchantu grinned, looking around at her companions. Naruna straightened, then wobbled her head. Oh, are you doing what I think you're doing? Uchantu nodded. We're going to help Arena get these off the track and flip them over. Then, while Bavlos and Indu scout around to make sure no Amai are coming after us, Naruna and I are going to reverse the polarity of the geororals that keep these cars off the ground and allow them to move so fast. I thought that was magnets, Arena said. Naruna shook her head, and Uchantu smiled at the Samyati woman. Only part of it is, Uchantu said, pointing to the track. Look at the obsidian plates. Arena frowned. Then her eyes went wide as Indu started laughing. Darkness, that's incredible. Why didn't we think of that before? Think of what? Edendo asked over the radio. Arena spoke before Uchantu could, a bit of awe in her voice. We can get the cars to attach themselves to the obsidian on the bottom of the transports. We can carry back the entire car with one of the transports. Uchantu nodded, and Arena shot her a wide grin. V to darkness, Edendo breathed. Drop everyone off and get here fast, Uchantu said. We may not have an opportunity like this again. Let's not let the Amaya take it from us.